There is a question most people spend their entire lives circling without ever asking it directly. Not because they are afraid of the answer, because they are afraid of what it would mean if the answer were true. The question is this: has anyone ever actually loved you? Not the version of you that learned to be agreeable, not the version that achieved things, or stayed quiet at the right moments, or remembered to be grateful, or performed the particular kind of stability that made the people around you feel comfortable. Not the version that earned its place at the table. You, the actual you, the one that existed before you learned what was required. Most people, when they sit with that question honestly, discover something that takes the breath away. They cannot find a clear memory of it. They can find memories of being praised, of being needed, of being approved of being told they were loved in moments when they were doing something right. But love that was simply there, unconditional, unearned, requiring nothing, present regardless of what you did or failed to do. That memory is harder to locate. For some people, it is nowhere at all. Carl Jung spent decades sitting with people who carried this exact wound, and what he discovered, across hundreds of patients and thousands of hours of clinical observation, was that this was not a rare or unusual experience. It was, in fact, one of the most common forms of psychological suffering he encountered. And more than that, it was the wound that sat at the root of nearly every other form of suffering he could identify. He called it, in various ways across his writings, the wound of conditional love. And he believed it was not simply painful. He believed it was structurally deforming, that it reshaped the architecture of the human psyche in ways that almost no one fully understood, and that continued to operate invisibly for the entirety of a person's life unless they were brought into direct and honest confrontation with it. This video is that confrontation. Not to cause pain, but because Jung understood something that most people who offer comfort about this subject do not. The only way through the wound of conditional love is not around it. It is directly through the center of it. And on the other side of that passage is something that cannot be reached any other way. The discovery of a love that was never actually taken from you, because it was never actually located in another person to begin with. Stop this video right now and write one thing in the comments. Describe the version of yourself you most carefully hid from the people who said they loved you. Not what they did wrong. What you hid. Just one thing. You do not have to explain it. Just name it. Because what you find in that answer is the beginning of what this video is actually about. To understand what Jung meant by conditional love, we have to begin where he always began. Not with the wound itself, but with the structure it creates. Every human being arrives in the world in a state of absolute dependency. The infant cannot feed itself, protect itself, regulate its own temperature, or survive a single hour without the active attention of another human being. This is not a metaphor. It is a biological fact. And it means that from the very first breath, the deepest layer of your nervous system is wired to do one thing above all others: ensure that you remain connected to the people who keep you alive. This drive for connection is not sentimental. It is survival. And because it is survival, it overrides everything else, including, crucially, the authentic expression of who you actually are. Here is what Jung observed. When a child expresses something that is received with warmth, with a smile, with approval, with the particular quality of attention that the child's nervous system registers as safety, the child learns. It learns that this expression is welcome. It learns that this part of itself is acceptable. It learns in the wordless language of early experience that this aspect of its being keeps the connection intact. But when a child expresses something that is received with withdrawal, with coldness, with disapproval, with the particular quality of absence that the child's nervous system registers as danger, the child learns something different. It learns that this expression is not welcome. It learns that this part of itself is not acceptable. It learns that this aspect of its being threatens the connection it cannot survive without. And so, the child makes a choice. Not a conscious choice. Not a calculated decision made from a position of awareness and agency. A survival choice, made in the deepest automatic layers of the psyche, faster than thought, faster than language, faster than anything that could be called a decision in the ordinary sense. The child begins to hide the unacceptable parts, begins to lead with the acceptable ones, begins to construct, piece by piece, the identity that the environment requires. Jung called this construction the persona, the mask, the socially adapted self that learns over years and decades of continuous refinement exactly how to present itself in order to remain connected, remain safe, remain loved, in the only way that love was ever offered. And here is the devastating core of what Jung discovered. The persona is not the self. It is the performance of a self. And the love that was offered in response to that performance was never, in the deepest sense, offered to you. It was offered to the performance. Most people, when they first encounter this idea, feel two things simultaneously. A sharp recognition, yes, that is exactly what happened, and an immediate impulse to soften it, to say, but they did love me in their way. They tried. They did the best they could. And this softening is not wrong. The people who shaped your persona almost certainly were not operating from malice. Most of them were simply passing on what had been passed to them. They learned conditional love from people who learned it from people who learned it from people, in a chain that goes back further than any of us can trace. But Jung was insistent on something that the softening tends to erase. The origin of the wound does not change the wound. Understanding why the conditioning happened does not undo the fact that it happened. Forgiving the people who created the condition does not automatically restore what the condition destroyed. What was destroyed, or more precisely, what was driven underground, was your ability to simply be yourself without simultaneously calculating the effect of that self on the people whose love you needed. Think about what this actually means. Think about how early that calculation begins. The infant who learns that crying is met with warmth versus the infant who learns that crying is met with irritation or absence. The toddler who learns that curiosity and exuberance are celebrated versus the one who learns that they are too much. The child who learns that anger is acceptable versus the one who learns that anger makes the people they love go away. By the time a child reaches school age, this calculation is already running constantly, automatically, beneath every interaction. What can I show? What must I hide? What version of me is safe here? What part of me needs to disappear? And by the time that child becomes an adult, the calculation has become so automatic, so deeply embedded in the structure of the psyche, that it no longer registers as a calculation at all. It registers as personality, as preferences, as natural inclinations. The person who always makes others laugh does not think of themselves as performing. They think of themselves as funny. The person who always makes themselves useful does not think of themselves as earning their keep. They think of themselves as helpful. The person who never expresses anger does not think of themselves as suppressing a part of their nature. They think of themselves as calm. Jung called this the process by which the persona colonizes the ego. The mask stops being something you wear and becomes something you are, or rather, and this is the precise and devastating truth of it, becomes something you believe you are. While the actual self, the one that existed before the calculation began, recedes further and further into the unconscious, into what Jung called the shadow, waiting. Here is what the shadow actually is, stripped of mysticism. It is not evil. It is not darkness in the moral sense. It is not the worst of you. It is the rest of you. every quality that was exiled in the service of remaining lovable, every emotion that was learned to be dangerous, every desire that was taught to be unacceptable, every version of yourself that was met, once too many times, with the particular coldness that told your nervous system, this part of you is not safe here. The shadow is not what you chose to hide. It is what you were forced to hide in order to remain connected to people who couldn't or wouldn't love you unconditionally. And here is what makes this so important to understand. Everything in the shadow is still alive. It did not die when it was driven underground. It did not dissolve when you stopped expressing it. It simply went somewhere you couldn't easily see. And from there, it continues to shape everything. It shapes the relationships you choose because you unconsciously seek out people who recreate the conditions of the original love. People whose approval must be earned. People whose love comes with requirements. People who make you work to remain acceptable. Not because you are damaged, because your nervous system is loyal. It is trying to solve the original problem by re-entering the original conditions and this time, finally, getting it right. It shapes the way you feel about yourself in quiet moments, when no one is performing and no one is watching, and the calculation briefly ceases. In those moments, many people discover something unexpected. They feel nothing, or worse than nothing. They feel a particular kind of emptiness that is almost indistinguishable from the conviction that there is no one actually there. That beneath the persona, beneath the performance, beneath the carefully constructed, acceptable self, there is simply absence. This feeling, Jung observed it constantly, is one of the most frightening and least understood experiences a human being can have, and it is almost universally misread. People who feel it conclude that they are empty, that they lack depth or substance or genuine selfhood, that the persona is not concealing a real self but replacing one that was never fully formed. Jung's observation was the opposite. The emptiness is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of distance. The self is there. It has always been there. But it has been so thoroughly buried under the requirements of conditional love that the distance between the ego and the actual self has become, in some cases, almost impossible to traverse without help. There is a specific pattern Jung identified that appears in almost everyone who grew up under the condition of conditional love. He called it projection of the persona, and it operates in a way that is almost painfully precise in how it recreates the original wound. The adult who learned that love was conditional begins unconsciously to love others conditionally as well. Not because they want to, not because they have decided to, because they have no lived experience of any other kind of love. The template they carry, the one laid down in those earliest years of neurological formation, is a love that comes with requirements. And so they reproduce that template in every relationship they form. They love their partners conditionally, though they rarely know they are doing it. They love their children conditionally, usually in precisely the ways their parents loved them, rewarding the qualities they were taught to value, withdrawing when the qualities they were taught to fear appear. They love their friends conditionally, their colleagues conditionally, their own future selves conditionally, and they love themselves most conditionally of all. This self-conditional love is perhaps the most painful consequence of the original wound, the internal voice that was formed in response to the original conditions, the one that sounds, if you listen closely enough, remarkably like the voice of the people who first established those conditions, never stops running its evaluation, never stops measuring the actual self against the requirements of the persona, never stops issuing verdicts about which parts are acceptable and which parts need to be hidden, managed, or eliminated. Jung called this internalized critical function the negative parent complex, and he was emphatic that it was not simply a psychological nuisance. It was, in his view, one of the most destructive forces operating in the human psyche, precisely because it operated in the name of love. Because the voice that tells you that you are too much, or not enough, or unlovable in your actual form, sounds like it is trying to protect you. Sounds like it is telling you the truth about yourself that you need to hear. Sounds, most perniciously of all, like it is simply accurate. It is not accurate. It is inherited. There is a difference. The question that Jung always arrived at, eventually, in his work with patients who carried the wound of conditional love, was this: what would it mean to be loved for who you actually are? Not who you have performed. Not who you were required to become. Who you actually are. The self beneath the persona. The parts that were exiled into shadow. The qualities that were taught were unacceptable. The desires that were suppressed. The emotions that were learned to be dangerous. What would it mean for all of that to be not just tolerated, but actually loved? For most people, this question produces a response that is disproportionate to what might be expected. It produces not relief, but grief. A grief that often feels completely out of proportion to the situation, as though the question has landed somewhere so deep and so long untouched that the response comes from a part of the self that has been waiting for a very long time to be asked. Jung understood this response. He called it the grief of the unlived self. The mourning for the life that might have been lived, the relationships that might have been formed, the person that might have emerged if the original conditions had been different. If the love had been given without requirements. If the self that arrived had been allowed to stay, fully, as it was. This grief, Jung insisted, was not a symptom to be managed or a stage to be moved through as quickly as possible. It was necessary. It was, in fact, the beginning of the most important work a person could do. Because the grief is not for something that was taken. It is for something that was never given, and the act of grieving it is the first act of acknowledging that it was owed to you, that you deserved, from the beginning, to be loved as you were, not as performance required you to become. Jung's framework for healing the wound of conditional love was built on a concept that sounds simple, and is, in practice, among the most difficult things a human being can attempt. He called it becoming a witness to the self. Not a critic, not a judge, not an evaluator measuring the self against requirements. A witness. Someone who sees what is actually there, all of it. The persona and the shadow, the acceptable and the exiled, the parts that performed well and the parts that were driven underground, and offers to all of it the same quality of attention. Not approval, not disapproval, simply presence, simply seeing. This witnessing is, Jung believed, the first experience of unconditional love that most people ever actually have. Because it comes from within. Because it does not require another person to be capable of something they were never taught. Because it does not depend on finding someone who can love you without conditions, though such people exist, and finding them matters enormously. It begins with you learning to see yourself without the conditional gaze that was the original lens of your formation. The process of becoming a witness to the self requires first the willingness to look at the persona honestly, to begin to distinguish between what you actually feel and what you have learned to display, between what you actually want and what you have learned to want in order to remain acceptable, between who you actually are and who you have been performing. This distinction is harder than it sounds because the persona has been in place for so long, in most cases, that the difference between performance and authentic expression has become genuinely difficult to detect. The person who has been performing stability for 40 years does not know what their actual emotional life feels like. The person who has been performing agreeableness for 3 decades does not know what their actual preferences are. The performance has overwritten the original signal so thoroughly that finding it again requires the kind of patient, sustained, compassionate attention that Jung devoted entire careers to describing. The second requirement is the willingness to meet what emerges from the shadow without immediately trying to manage it. The anger that appears when the performance is relaxed. The grief that surfaces when the vigilance drops. The desire that shows itself when no one is watching. The parts of yourself that were learned to be unacceptable. Jung was clear about what this meeting requires. Not expression of everything that emerges, wisdom about what is expressed and to whom and when remains necessary and important. But acknowledgement. The internal acknowledgement that this is real, that this belongs to you, that this part of you has the same right to exist as the parts you have allowed yourself to show. This acknowledgement is not simple. It runs directly against the deepest conditioning of the psyche, the conditioning that says these parts must be hidden in order to remain safe. The work of shadow integration is, in its essence, the work of learning to disagree with that conditioning, to say, quietly and consistently, to the parts of yourself that were exiled, you are allowed to be here. You always were. There is something else Jung understood about the wound of conditional love that almost no one discusses, and it may be the most important thing of all. The wound does not only shape how you receive love from others, it shapes how you understand love itself. If the only love you have ever experienced was conditional, if every experience of warmth and approval and connection that you can remember came attached to a requirement, then your definition of love will be built from those experiences. Love, to the nervous system that has only known conditional love, is synonymous with effort, with performance, with the continuous labor of being acceptable. And this means that when unconditional love appears, when someone offers you genuine warmth that requires nothing, that is simply there, that does not withdraw when you fail to perform correctly, your nervous system does not recognize it as love. It registers it as something else, something suspicious, something that must have hidden requirements you have not yet identified, something too easy to be real, because everything real that has ever felt like love has required work to earn and effort to maintain. This is why people who carry the wound of conditional love so frequently find genuine love intolerable, why they self-sabotage in relationships with people who actually see them, why they are more comfortable with love they have to earn than love they simply receive, why unconditional acceptance, when it finally appears, produces not relief but anxiety. Jung called this the paradox of the wounded capacity for love. The very thing most needed is the very thing most difficult to receive, because the psyche has been shaped by its absence for so long that its presence is disorienting. It does not fit the template, and the template, no matter how painful, is familiar. And familiarity, to the nervous system, is safety. This is the deepest work of healing the wound of conditional love, not simply learning to give yourself the witnessing attention that was never given to you, not simply integrating the shadow, not simply mourning the unlived self, but learning, gradually and with enormous patience, to let love in when it appears in its actual form, to retrain the nervous system to recognize as safe what was never safe before, to slowly, imperfectly, with frequent backsliding and confusion, allow the experience of being seen and accepted as you actually are to become, over time, something that can be received rather than fled. This is the work, not dramatic, not swift, not completed in any single moment of revelation, but real, the most real work there is. And here is what Jung found on the other side of it, in the patients who did this work with honesty and courage and enough time. They did not become different people. They became themselves. The self that had been performing gradually became less necessary. The calculation that had run automatically since childhood gradually became quieter. The parts that had been in shadow gradually found their way into the light. Not because they were forced or excavated or deliberately retrieved, but because when the conditions that required them to be hidden finally began to change, they simply, naturally, returned. And what returned was not chaos or dysfunction. It was color, texture, specificity, the particular quality of an actual human being rather than a curated presentation of one. The emotions that had been suppressed did not arrive as floods of dangerous feeling. They arrived as information. The desires that had been denied did not produce dissolution of the self. They produced direction. The parts of the self that had been exiled in the service of conditional love did not destroy the persona when they returned. They transformed it from something maintained by necessity into something worn lightly, by choice, appropriately, when the situation calls for it. Jung believed this was the closest thing to freedom that the human psyche could achieve. Not freedom from the self, freedom to be it. Not liberation from the conditions of your formation. You cannot undo what shaped you. Liberation from the belief that the shaped self is the only self that is allowed to exist. The self beneath the persona, your actual self, the one that existed before the calculation began, the one that is still there, waiting with a patience that should, if you sit with it, completely undo you, was never actually destroyed. It was never taken from you. It has been here, underneath everything, for the entirety of your life, and it does not need to be earned back. It does not need to be deserved. It does not need to be approved of, or validated, or assessed by any external measure before it is allowed to be present. It simply needs to be witnessed by you. That is all it has ever needed. Not the love of someone who finally sees you completely. Though that love, when it comes, is real and it matters. But the prior love, the foundational one, the love that must be generated from inside the self before it can be reliably recognized or received from outside. The love that says, I see what was hidden. I see what was required to disappear. I see the performance and I see what the performance was protecting, and I am not going anywhere. That love, the love you offer yourself when you finally stop running the calculation, is not sentimental. It is not easy. It is not comfortable in the way that approval is comfortable, because it does not depend on you doing anything correctly. It is simply true. And truth, even when it hurts, even when it costs everything the performance was designed to protect, is the only foundation on which anything real can be built. You were never unlovable. The parts of you that were hidden were not hidden because they were unworthy. They were hidden because the people who were supposed to love them unconditionally did not know how. And that failure, as real and as costly as it was never about you. It was always about what they had been taught love required. Now you get to learn something different.